The universe, in its infinite breadth, had never been kind to those who assumed they understood it. The Shi'ar Empire had mapped 10,000 star systems, subjugated 1,000 civilizations, and built stargates that stitched the fabric of space together like golden thread through silk. They had faced the Kree, humbled the Skrull, and stood toe-to-toe with beings who called themselves gods. They were, by every measurable metric, one of the most formidable spacefaring civilizations in their reality. None of that prepared them for what waited on the other side of the broken gate. It began, as catastrophes often do, without warning. The Shi'ar Imperial Battle Fleet, Eternal Majesty, 7 dreadnoughts, 23 cruisers, and a complement of 112 fighter wings, was conducting standard warp transit exercises near the edge of Shi'ar space, stress testing a newly constructed Stargate array designated Threshold Corindal. The gate was a marvel of Shi'ar engineering, a ring of pale neutronium alloy 2 kilometers in diameter, crackling with controlled energy that could fold the distance between star systems into a single step. Fleet Admiral Carden Voss stood on the bridge of the dreadnought Resplendent Will, watching through the viewport as the gate hummed to life with familiar violet light. Then the light turned wrong. The violet became something that had no name in Shi'ar. Chromatic science, a color that existed at the intersection of sensation and dread, a hue that the human mind, had any been present, might have called the visual equivalent of a scream. The gate shuddered. Alarms cascaded across every console on every ship in the fleet simultaneously. Voss gripped the edge of his command, thrown as the Resplendent Will lurched forward, not by engine thrust, but by suction, as though the gate had become a wound in space itself, bleeding inward. All stop, Voss commanded. Emergency reverse thrust. Close the gate, close it now. The gate didn't close. It consumed. In the span of 11 seconds, the entire Eternal Majesty fleet was pulled through Threshold Corindal as it catastrophically destabilized, the controlled fold of space collapsing into something far older and far hungrier. The gate behind them simply ceased to exist. No wreckage, no energy signature, no path home. Where the Stargate array had hung in the void, there was now only the indifferent dark of a star system that appeared on no Shi'ar chart, orbiting a star of bilious, sickly yellow light, in a galaxy that their navigational systems could not recognize. Admiral Voss stared at his sensor display for a long moment. "Report," he said, very quietly. His science officer, a young Shi'ar named Tessavel, was cycling through readings, with the controlled panic of someone who had trained for crises and discovered that training was insufficient. "Admiral, stellar cartography finds no match for our current position in any known database. The background cosmic radiation pattern is inconsistent with our universe's standard profile. The fundamental constants appear identical, but there are subspace harmonics that our instruments weren't designed to measure." She paused, and when she looked up, her avian eyes were wide with something Voss hadn't seen in her before. "Admiral, there is something wrong with this space. The sensors are detecting dimensional bleed from what appears to be a parallel energy dimension, vast, sir, incomprehensibly vast, and it is aware of us." Voss had fought in 3 Imperial Wars. He had stood in the presence of the Shi'ar Death Commandos without flinching. He was not, by any reasonable definition, a man who frightened easily. "Shields to maximum," he said. "All fleet vessels, battle stations. Signal the Imperial Guard transport. I want Gladiator on standby." The Imperial Guard, 12 of the Empire's most formidable warriors, stationed aboard the escort carrier Praetorian's Edge, traveling with the fleet as a standard precaution for a high-value military exercise. Kaulark, Gladiator, the praetor of the Imperial Guard, whose strength was functionally limitless when his confidence held, whose body could survive the heart of a star, was at that moment standing in the observation deck of his ship, arms folded behind his back, looking out at the alien stars with the expression of a man who had already begun calculating. He did not like this place. The feeling was not fear. Gladiator did not process the sensation of fear in any conventional way. It was something more fundamental, a wrongness that registered not in his mind but in his cells, in the Strontian physiology that made him what he was. The stars here were the right shape. The physics appeared sound. But there was something beneath the physics, something that pushed against the edge of perception, like a sound pitched too low to hear but felt in the chest nonetheless. Something that, if he concentrated, almost seemed to be reaching back. He was still examining that sensation when the first signals appeared on the fleet's long-range sensors. Ships, hundreds of them, bearing down on the Eternal Majesty fleet at attack velocity. They were enormous, larger than Shi'ar dreadnoughts, shaped with the brutal, unlovely pragmatism of civilizations that had decided aesthetics were a luxury and mass was a virtue. They were gray and scarred and ancient-looking, covered in markings that the universal translation Matrix began working on immediately, pulling what it could from electromagnetic emissions, from the patterned signals bouncing between the vessels. Gothic script, Aquilas, the numerals of a calendar system that counted years in the tens of thousands. And they were not hailing. They were not broadcasting demands for identification, or warnings to stand down, or diplomatic overtures of any kind. They were running weapons hot, energy, signatures consistent with lance batteries, and macro cannon arrays warming to firing solutions. Turrets tracking across the Shi'ar fleet, with the mechanical certainty of a civilization that had long since stopped asking questions before it started killing. Tessavel looked up from her console. "Admiral, I'm detecting targeting locks across our entire fleet formation. The approaching vessels are." The first salvo hit before she could finish the sentence. Void Shield screamed. Two Shi'ar cruisers on the fleet's port wing took direct hits from weapons that fired physical projectiles at subrelativistic velocities, shells the size of hablocks, fired from cannons that used controlled plasma ignition to accelerate solid metal to speeds that made the impact equivalent to a small nuclear detonation. The Shi'ar energy shielding held, barely, on the first volley, but the structural stress reports flooding Voss's display were sobering. These were not primitive weapons. These were the weapons of a civilization that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing at range. "Return fire," Voss ordered. "Target their weapons systems. Non-lethal if possible. We don't know who these people are." Non-lethal against the Imperial Navy of the Adeptus Terra in the 41st millennium of human history. In a galaxy where mercy was a tactical error and hesitation was a death sentence. In a universe where the concept of a warning shot had been largely abandoned. Sometime around the 33rd millennium, the Shi'ar had just made their first mistake. They wouldn't understand why for some time yet. But the galaxy around them, this dark, grinding, pitiless galaxy, was already beginning to take note of their arrival. Far away, in the churning nightmare dimension that pressed against the skin of real space like a tongue against a wound, something vast and ancient and endlessly hungry turned a portion of its attention toward the new arrivals. Something in the warp smiled. If you want to see more civilizations clash across impossible universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a crossover you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper. The battle lasted 47 minutes. By any conventional military metric, it should not have been a battle at all. The Shi'ar Empire's technological baseline exceeded the Imperium of man's in several critical areas. Their energy shielding was more efficient, their directed energy weapons more precise, and their tactical computing systems operated at speeds that made Imperial cogitators look like abacuses. The Eternal Majesty fleet outmaneuvered the Imperial Navy squadron at every turn, reading firing solutions before they were fully calculated, sliding cruisers out of lance battery kill zones with a fluid grace that the Imperial captains, trained in the brutal, grinding, attritional warfare of the 41st millennium, had simply never encountered. None of that mattered as much as Admiral Voss had hoped. The Imperial Navy did not fight to win elegantly. It fought to win completely, and it fought with an institutional stubbornness that bordered on theological conviction, because for many of its officers, it was theological conviction. The squadron that had engaged the Eternal Majesty fleet, 17 vessels of the Segmentum Obscurus patrol fleet, designated Hammer of Illumination under Admiral Commodore Erasmus Thrent, had taken catastrophic damage in the first exchange. 3 of Thrent's cruisers were venting atmosphere and drive plasma. His flagship, the Inexorable Penance, had lost its port lance battery entirely to a precision Shi'ar energy strike. that had somehow threaded through its void shields at an angle that the ship's machine spirit had failed to anticipate. Thrent had responded by ordering his remaining vessels to close to point-blank range and continue firing. This was not tactical genius. It was not even particularly sound military thinking by any standard the Shi'ar understood. It was something else, a fundamental, philosophical commitment to the idea that the appropriate response to being outgunned was to get close enough that being outgunned stopped mattering. Imperial Navy doctrine, distilled through 10,000 years of war against enemies that defied comprehension, had arrived at a simple conclusion. Keep shooting until you cannot shoot anymore, and then find a way to keep shooting anyway. Voss watched his damage reports with growing unease. His fleet had won the engagement by every measurable standard. The Imperial squadron was crippled, 2 of its vessels reduced to drifting hulks, the rest falling back in obvious disarray. The Shi'ar had lost shields on 4 cruisers and taken structural damage to 1 dreadnought's forward section. Acceptable losses by any reasonable accounting. And yet, they're not retreating, Tessavel said, staring at her display. Admiral, the damaged vessels, they're not retreating. They're still firing. The 2 hulks that we assessed as combat ineffective are still attempting to bring weapons to bear. One of them has lost life support on 60% of its decks, and it is still firing. Voss stared at the sensor feed. The inexorable pennants, its port side a ragged mess of torn metal and cooling plasma, was grinding forward on its remaining engines. Macro cannons cycling through whatever ammunition remained in its depleted magazines, firing not with any hope of meaningful tactical effect, but with the grim mechanical persistence of a civilization that had decided surrender was not a category of response it recognized. Open a channel, Voss said. All frequencies. Translation matrix active. The channel opened. What came through was not, initially, words. It was music, or something that functioned as music, a deep, grinding, atonal hymn that the translation matrix identified as a battle cant of the Adeptus Mini-Storm, sung by the surviving crew of the inexorable Penance as their ship died. Around them, when the words resolved through the translation filter, they spoke of sacrifice, of the God Emperor's light, of death as a threshold rather than an ending. They're singing, said Voss's tactical officer, Draven, with an expression that suggested he was reassessing several foundational assumptions about the universe. They're dying and they're singing. Tessavel corrected quietly. Voss keyed his transmission. Vessels of the unknown fleet. This is Admiral Carden, Voss of the Shi'ar Imperial Navy. We have no hostile intent toward your civilization. We entered this region of space accidentally and seek only to establish communication and, if possible, find a means of returning to our own territory. We are standing down our weapons. We request parley. The hymn continued for another 12 seconds. Then it stopped. What replaced it was a single voice, Admiral Commodore Erasmus Thrent, speaking through a voxcaster damaged enough that his words arrived wrapped in static and the groan of stressed metal. He was, based on the vocal stress patterns the translation matrix identified, badly wounded. He was also, unmistakably, still in command of himself. Xenos fleet. The word Xenos landed with a particular weight that the translation matrix conveyed imperfectly. It was not merely a descriptor. It was a category, a theological classification. You have destroyed vessels of the Imperial Navy and killed servants of the God Emperor of mankind. There is no parley. There is no accord. There is only the accounting. A pause, filled with the groan of his dying ship. Reinforcements have been called. The Imperium of Man does not forget. The Imperium of Man does not forgive. Whatever you are, wherever you came from, you have made an enemy of 10 billion worlds and the undying will of the master of mankind. Another pause. Ave Imperator. The channel closed. Voss sat in silence for a moment. Around him, the bridge crew of the Resplendent will processed what they had just heard with varying degrees of visible discomfort. 10 billion worlds. The Shi'ar Empire encompassed thousands of systems and was considered one of the largest interstellar powers in their home reality. 10 billion worlds suggested a scale of civilization that made the Shi'ar look, by comparison, like a regional government. He might be exaggerating, Draven offered. He wasn't, Gladiator said. The praetor of the Imperial Guard had arrived on the bridge during the final minutes of the engagement, standing now at the rear of the command deck with his arms folded, his purple mohawk and blue skin making him look like a statue of war given aesthetic opinions. He had been listening. He had also been using the engagement to conduct his own assessment, his Strontian senses reading the battle in ways that no sensor suite could replicate. The damaged vessels, Gladiator continued, walking forward slowly. I monitored their crew signals during the fight. They never wavered. Not when their shields failed. Not when their companions died beside them. Not when they knew they were losing. He stopped beside Voss's command throne and looked out at the sensor display, where the crippled Imperial ships continued their grinding, purposeless advance. I have fought beside Shi'ar soldiers my entire career. I know what courage looks like. What those crews demonstrated was something different. Something deeper than training or discipline. He was quiet for a moment. They believe, completely, without reservation, in something worth dying for. Voss studied the display. Their emperor, whatever their emperor is, Gladiator replied. He has built something remarkable and terrible. He turned to face the admiral directly. We need to understand this civilization before we take another action, because if that Commodore was even partially accurate about their scale, we are not in a conflict we can win by force. It was coming from Gladiator, a being who had once traded blows with the Hulk and survived at the center of a collapsing star, a statement that commanded absolute attention. Voss nodded slowly. He was already rerouting his analysis teams, pulling every scrap of electromagnetic data they had gathered during the engagement, every Vox intercept, every symbol from those battered gray hulls. The translation matrix was working through Gothic script and iconography with increasing speed, building a picture of a civilization that was vast and ancient and burning with a fire that had nothing to do with the stars. He did not yet know about the warp. He did not yet understand that the wrongness his fleet had felt upon arrival was not an anomaly but a constant, a permanent feature of this universe, a dimension of psychic nightmare pressed against reality, like a hand against glass, populated by entities that fed on belief and fear and the particular frequency of emotion that a fleet of soldiers singing hymns while their ship died around them produced in extraordinary quantities. He did not know that the warp had noticed his fleet the moment they arrived. He did not know that it was already sending something to investigate. But 3 ships back, in the belly of the fleet, the Shi'ar psychers, low-level telepaths used for communication and tactical analysis, were beginning to experience symptoms that the fleet's medical officers were logging with mounting concern. Nosebleeds, auditory hallucinations. One had locked herself in her quarters and was scratching symbols into the wall that no one could read. The galaxy's oldest and most patient predator had scented something new in its waters, and it was hungry. The psycher's name was Miravel Soon, and she had served the Shi'ar Imperial Navy for 11 years without incident. She was not a warrior. Her telepathic gifts were modest by Shi'ar standards, sufficient for fleet communications, for reading the emotional tenor of diplomatic exchanges, for sensing the broad shape of intentions in a crowded room. She had never encountered anything her abilities could not process, categorize, and file away in the orderly mental architecture that her training had built. She was precise, disciplined, and professionally unremarkable in the way that made her exactly the kind of person a fleet needed and rarely thought about. She had begun hearing the voice approximately 6 hours after the fleet's arrival in this impossible galaxy. It had started as background noise, the kind of psychic static that any telepath learned to filter, the emotional bleed of 12,000 crew members going about their duties, the low hum of minds engaged in routine tasks. But beneath that familiar texture, there was something else, a bass note, a pressure, the sensation of standing at the edge of a cliff in darkness, knowing the drop was there without being able to see it, feeling the air move differently over the void. By the 14th hour, the bass note had become a frequency. By the 20th, the frequency had become something approaching a voice. By the time the fleet's medical officer filed his first formal report, 7 psychers, presenting with identical symptoms, ranging from minor bleeding to full catatonic withdrawal, Mirabelle had stopped sleeping entirely. Because sleeping meant the voice got louder. She sat cross-legged on the floor of her quarters aboard the resplendent Will, her back against the bunk, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes fixed on the middle distance with the focused vacancy of someone performing the most strenuous mental labor of their life. The symbols she had scratched into the wall, and she had no memory of scratching them, which was the most frightening part, had been photographed, translated by the ship's linguistic database, and returned to Admiral Voss with a report that said, in the careful language of a science officer trying not to sound alarmed, that the symbols appeared to correspond to no known language in the Shi'ar database but possessed structural characteristics consistent with extremely old written systems, possibly predating recorded Shi'ar history. What the report did not convey, because there was no clinical language adequate for it, was what the symbols felt like to look at. 3 crew members assigned to photograph them had requested psychological evaluation afterward. One had simply refused to re-enter the room. Gladiator stood in the doorway of Mirabelle's quarters now, studying her with the careful attention of a man who trusted his instincts and whose instincts were currently producing significant concern. He had reviewed the medical reports. He had spoken with the fleet's senior science officers. He had stood on the observation deck for 2 hours, looking out at the stars of this alien galaxy, feeling that persistent wrongness in his cells and trying to identify its source. He had come to a conclusion that he did not like. Mirabelle, he said quietly, her eyes focused slowly, like a lens adjusting. Praetor. Her voice was steady, which suggested considerable effort. I know what you're going to ask. Tell me anyway. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the viewport, the stars of the 41st millennium burned with their ancient, indifferent light. It isn't a civilization, she said finally. What I'm hearing, what all of us are hearing, it isn't technology or a weapon or an alien species with telepathic abilities. It's a dimension, a place, and it's alive or something close enough to alive that the distinction doesn't matter. She pressed her fingers against her temples, and it is full, absolutely full, Praetor. I've touched minds across 40 star systems in my career. I've felt the background psychic presence of populated worlds. This is millions of worlds, billions of minds, thousands of years of war and death and suffering and belief, all of it bleeding into this other place and feeding something there. She looked up at him directly, something that just noticed us. Gladiator held her gaze. Can you block it? I've been blocking it for 20 hours, she said. I won't be able to much longer. He nodded once, filed that information in the part of his mind reserved for tactical problems, requiring immediate solutions, and left her to her vigil. He was crossing the corridor toward the command deck when the ship shuddered. Not from weapons fire, not from engine stress or gravitational anomaly. The resplendent will shuddered the way a living thing shudders, a full-body tremor that moved through the hull plating and the deck, grating in the bones of everyone aboard simultaneously, a vibration at a frequency that had no business existing in hard vacuum. Every light on the deck flickered. Every console screen strobed with static that, for just a moment, resolved into patterns that no one's eyes could quite track before the system stabilized. In the fleet's communication array, a signal appeared. It was broadcasting on every frequency simultaneously, not the structured signal of a naval vessel or a planetary government, but something that moved through the communication systems the way water moves, through cracks, finding every available channel and filling it. The translation matrix worked on it for 40 seconds before producing an output, and when it did, the officer monitoring the array stared at the result for a long moment before deciding that this was above his rank to process alone. The signal, translated, read, "You are new. New is interesting. New is hungry-making. The gods see you, little birds from nowhere. The gods are curious. One of them would like to speak with your most ambitious." Admiral Voss read the translation twice. Source: unknown, sir, the communications officer said. It isn't coming from any specific point in space. It appears to be originating from everywhere. Simultaneously, before Voss could process that, a second signal cut through. This one had a source, a single vessel, emerging from behind the debris field of the engagement, running on minimum power, with its weapon systems cold and what appeared to be a deliberate gesture of non-aggression. It was Shi'ar in silhouette, but wrong in proportion. Its hull plated in ceramite and adamantium. Its prow bearing the 8-pointed star of the chaos, undivided in letters of burning bronze. A space marine vessel, chaos-aligned, ancient beyond any Shi'ar reference for age. The voice that came through was deep and layered. A human voice modulated by centuries of warp exposure into something that sat at the border between organic and something else entirely. The translation matrix processed it with unusual speed, as though this speaker had long practiced making himself understood across linguistic barriers. Shi'ar, the voice said, I am Vorathax the Undying, Demon Prince of Tsench, Lord of the Fractured Blade, 3 times blessed by the Changer of Ways. A pause calibrated for effect. You have arrived in a galaxy at war with itself, surrounded by enemies who will not stop until you are dead or converted or consumed. The Imperium will send more ships. They always send more ships. The Tyranids will find your biosignatures within the month. The Necrons are already aware of you. Another pause. I, however, am offering something none of them will. A conversation. Voss looked at Gladiator. Gladiator looked at the signal source on the display. His jaw set, his eyes calculating. A demon prince. The intelligence files being assembled from intercepted Imperial communications had begun producing entries on the entities of chaos with increasing frequency and increasing alarm. Beings of the warp given physical form through worship and atrocity. Ancient and powerful and possessed of the particular cunning that came from spending centuries learning exactly what mortals wanted to hear. He's not wrong about our situation, Draven said carefully from the tactical console. He's not wrong about anything he's said so far, Gladiator replied. That's what makes him dangerous. He turned to Voss. Do not answer. Not yet. Let him wait. He straightened, his cape settling around his shoulders, with the gravity of a man, making a decision that he knew would define what followed. I'll speak with him. Voss frowned. Gladiator, if this entity is what the Imperial files suggest, it will read any response from this ship as an indicator of our command structure, our decision-making hierarchy, and our psychological profile. Gladiator's expression was composed, certain, the famous Strontian, confidence that was simultaneously his greatest strength and the foundation of his power, operating at full clarity. Let it read me instead. I am harder to profile than a fleet admiral. He walked toward the shuttle bay with the measured stride of a man who had faced things far older than this galaxy's gods and was still, indisputably, walking. Behind him, in her quarters, Miravel soon felt the warp's attention shift slightly, the great, roiling mass of psychic energy, adjusting its focus toward the praetor of the Imperial Guard. The way of fire adjusts toward new fuel, and in the scratched symbols on her wall, something that had not been there before was visible now, a new mark, added without any hand to add it, that the translation matrix would eventually identify as the closest Cientian equivalent to a single word. Delicious. The shuttle that carried Gladiator toward Vorathax's vessel was a standard Shi'ar diplomatic craft, sleek, unarmed, its hull broadcasting the universal non-aggression frequency that the Shi'ar used when they wanted to signal peaceful intent across species barriers. It was, under normal circumstances, a sensible precaution. In the 41st millennium, it was roughly equivalent to walking into a war zone carrying a sign, explaining that you meant well. Gladiator sat alone in the passenger compartment, arms resting on his knees, eyes forward, reviewing everything the fleet's intelligence teams had assembled on Chaos in the 18 hours since the first warp signal had appeared. The files were incomplete, built from intercepted Imperial communications, fragmentary Vox transmissions, the theological texts of the Adeptus Mini-Storm that the translation matrix had begun processing, but they were sufficient to construct a working picture, and the picture was not reassuring. The Chaos gods were not gods in the way the Shi'ar understood divinity. The Shi'ar had encountered beings of immense power who claimed godhood, the Phoenix Force, the Celestials, abstract entities that existed at scales that made conventional comprehension inadequate. Those beings were, in some fundamental sense, comprehensible. They had origins. They had natures. They operated according to internal logics that, once understood, could be worked with or worked around. The Chaos Gods were different. They were not beings who had achieved transcendence. They were the distilled essence of mortal psychology given independent existence by the psychic weight of billions of minds across thousands of years. Sinch was not a being who liked change and manipulation. Sinch was change and manipulation. Every act of scheming, every shift of plan, every moment of hope twisted into betrayal across the entire history of this galaxy's sentient life, crystallized into a singular conscious entity of incomprehensible scale. It did not want things in the way that people wanted things. It was wanting, given a face. Gladiator found this more unsettling than anything with a straightforward power profile. The Chaos vessel resolved through the shuttle's viewport as it approached. A strike cruiser of ancient Heresy-era manufacture, its original Imperial markings buried under centuries of warp-touched modification. Where the original hull had been functional and severe, it was now covered in Baroque ornamentation that shifted subtly as the eye moved across it. Architectural details that didn't quite resolve into stable shapes. Windows that looked into spaces that couldn't exist within the ship's physical dimensions. The docking bay that opened to receive the shuttle breathed. There was no other word for it. The metal contracting and expanding in slow rhythms that corresponded to no mechanical process. Gladiator stepped out of the shuttle into a docking bay that smelled of ozone and copper and something beneath, both that had no scent category in any Shi'ar reference. The gravity was slightly wrong, not dangerously so, a fraction of a degree off standard in a direction that wasn't quite down. Vorathax was waiting. He was enormous, 3 meters of transhuman flesh warped by centuries of warp exposure into something that occupied the border between the physical and the conceptual. His armor was the deep blue and gold of Sinch's favored palette, covered in eyes that opened and closed independently of one another, each one a different color, each one tracking with its own agenda. His face was still recognizably human in its basic architecture, broad, angular, weathered with age that had stopped progressing conventionally sometime in the 32nd millennium. But his eyes were entirely wrong. Pupils that spiraled inward toward depths that suggested looking into them too long would be structurally inadvisable. 2 curving horns swept back from his brow. His left hand had too many joints. He looked at Gladiator with the comprehensive attention of a being that had spent several thousand years learning to read people. In the first 3 seconds of meeting them, remarkable, Vorathax said. His voice in person carried harmonics that the shuttle's communication system had filtered out layers beneath. The primary frequency, each one a different emotional register, a different implication, a different pressure point being assessed and cataloged simultaneously. Your confidence is not performance. Most beings project confidence as a social behavior. Yours is structural, foundational. He tilted his head, the gesture uncannily bird-like. What happens when the foundation cracks? Nothing that concerns you, Gladiator said. You wanted a conversation. I'm here for the conversation. Begin. Vorathax smiled with the patience of someone for whom time was a suggestion rather than a constraint. He turned and walked deeper into the ship, gesturing for Gladiator to follow with a casual certainty that he would be obeyed. Gladiator followed, not from obedience, but because the information available through direct engagement with this entity was worth more than the tactical discomfort of walking into his territory. The corridor they moved through was lined with what appeared to be tactical displays, but where Shi'ar tactical displays showed space, fleet positions, stellar cartography, these showed something else. Timelines, branching possibility trees of extraordinary complexity, futures cascading from decision points like rivers from a watershed, some of them labeled in scripts that changed language every time. Gladiator's eyes moved to read them. Your fleet, Vorathax said conversationally, has approximately 19 standard days before the Imperium's response reaches critical mass. The signal your engagement broadcast traveled at speeds your sensors didn't detect, through channels your instruments cannot measure. 3 Space Marine chapters have already been alerted. A Grey Knight's strike force, the Imperium's specialists in exactly the kind of anomalous dimensional events your fleet represents, is being assembled at Titan. He Glance back at Gladiator. You understand what Grey Knights are. Warriors trained specifically to fight entities from the dimension you inhabit. Gladiator said, yes, trained to fight them, purified against their influence, psychically fortified to a degree that makes them largely immune to the methods that work on ordinary mortals. Vorathax paused before a viewport that looked out at stars that shifted position when not directly observed, which means that the Imperium's most effective counter to warp-based threats is en route to your fleet, alongside 3 chapters of Space Marines who will not negotiate, and a Titan Legion that has been redirected from the Cadian Gate at considerable political cost, which indicates how seriously your arrival has been classified. He turned to face Gladiator fully. Your fleet is exceptional. I have been studying your combat data since the moment you arrived. Your technology is genuinely impressive. Your tactics sophisticated. Your command structure functional and adaptable. A pause. You will be destroyed within 20 days if you remain on your current course. Gladiator met the spiraling eyes without flinching. And you're offering an alternative. I'm offering context, Vorathax corrected, with the precision of a being for whom the distinction mattered enormously. The Imperium is not your only option, but it is the option you're currently careening toward through ignorance. There are others. The Tau Empire, to the galactic east, young, rational, diplomatically inclined, though limited in scale. The Eldari craft worlds, ancient, powerful, possessed of psychic traditions that might help your sensitives understand what they're experiencing before it kills them. His eyes caught Gladiators and held them. And there are the powers of the warp, who find your fleet extraordinarily interesting. You are untouched by the corruption that permeates every other civilization in this galaxy. You are, from a certain perspective, pristine. The gods notice pristine things. I'm certain they do, Gladiator said. What do the gods want with us? Sench, Vorathax said carefully, wants to understand you. To know how a civilization of your sophistication thinks, chooses, adapts. The Changer of Ways finds your arrival improbable to a degree that suggests intention, even if no one intended it. He spread his hands, both of them, the one with too many joints moving with a fluidity that was quietly wrong. You are a variable no one planned for. In a galaxy where every faction has calculated every other faction's moves for millennia, you are genuinely new. That is, he seemed to search for the precise word. Exhilarating. Gladiator was quiet for a moment. The corridor hummed around. Then with the particular sound of warp-adjacent machinery, a sound that pushed against the inside of the skull in ways that were difficult to ignore and impossible to entirely dismiss. You've told me what Cinch wants, Gladiator said. You've told me what the Imperium will do. You've told me where the Tau and the Eldari are. He looked at Vorathax with the direct, uncompromising focus that had made him the most feared warrior in Shi'ar space. You haven't told me what you want. Vorathax was quiet for 3 full seconds, which, from a being of his processing capacity, represented a significant pause. Then he smiled again, and this time the smile reached the spiraling eyes. And what Gladiator saw there was not malevolence, or hunger, or the cold calculation he'd been braced for. It was, unmistakably, delight. I want to watch, Vorathax said simply. I have lived in this galaxy for 3,000 years. I know every move every faction will make before they make it. I know every war's outcome before the first shot. He looked at Gladiator with something approaching genuine warmth. The warmth of a man who has been bored for centuries discovering something that interests him. I have absolutely no idea what you're going to do next. Do you understand how rare that is? Gladiator held his gaze. Rare enough that you'd help us. Rare enough, Vorathax confirmed, that I'd do almost anything to keep you alive long enough to find out. Back aboard the resplendent Will, Miravel soon had finally fallen asleep from exhaustion, the first sleep in 22 hours. In her dreams, the warp spoke clearly for the first time, its voice not the grinding malevolence she'd braced for, but something more complex and more dangerous. It spoke in the voice of every person she'd ever trusted, and it told her exactly what she wanted to hear. The council that Admiral Voss convened aboard the Resplendent, well, 18 hours after Gladiator's return was, by any standard of Shi'ar diplomatic procedure, an unusual gathering. Present were Voss himself, his senior tactical and science officers, 3 members of the Imperial Guard, Gladiator, Oracle, and Smasher, chosen for their particular combination of combat capability and analytical intelligence, and via heavily encrypted subspace link that the fleet's communications team had spent 6 hours establishing through channels that didn't officially exist. A voice that identified itself as Inquisitor Yoel Dorn of the Ordo Xenos. The Inquisitor had found them. This was, in itself, a demonstration of capability that the Shi'ar intelligence officers had noted with professional respect and personal unease. The Ordo Xenos, the branch of the Imperium's Inquisition dedicated specifically to the study, containment, and when necessary, elimination of alien threats, had located the Eternal Majesty fleet through means that the Shi'ar communications team couldn't fully trace, established contact through a channel that bypassed 3 layers of Shi'ar encryption and opened the conversation not with demands or threats, but with a single sentence, delivered and flawlessly translated. Shi'ar standard. You have 19 days before this situation becomes unrecoverable. I suggest we use them. Inquisitor Dorn was based on everything the translation matrix conveyed through her voice, tone, cadence, the particular textures of authority that crossed species boundaries. A woman who had spent a very long time being the most dangerous person in any room she entered, and who had arrived at a place beyond the need to demonstrate it. She was economical. She was precise. She asked questions that suggested she already knew most of the answers and was verifying the remainder. She was also, Gladiator noted, distinctly separate from the Imperium's standard response to Xeno's contact, where Admiral Commodore Thrent had opened with macro cannons and closed with hymns. Dorn operated in the spaces between official positions, the Inquisition's particular territory, answerable ultimately only to itself, and the distant, silent authority of the God Emperor whose consciousness the Shi'ar were beginning to understand was simultaneously the Imperium's greatest protection and its most profound mystery. The Grey Knight's deployment has been authorized, Dorn said, her voice arriving through the encrypted channel with the flat certainty of someone reporting weather conditions. You have 19 days before Brother Captain Aldrich's strike force reaches optimal intercept range. At that point, the situation moves out of my ability to influence it and into the domain of individuals whose mandate does not include discretion, a pause that contained considerable implication. I am not those individuals. You're offering to help us, Voss said carefully. I'm offering to help myself, Dorn corrected, with a precision that reminded Gladiator of Vorathax's careful distinction between context and alternatives. The 41st millennium, it appeared, produced individuals who communicated in very exact terms. Your fleet represents an unprecedented xenological event. The data your existence provides, the dimensional mechanics of your arrival, the nature of your technology, the biological profile of your species is of extraordinary value to the Ordo Xenos. I have spent 30 years studying alien civilizations. You are something I have never encountered. Another pause. I would prefer to study you living. Oracle, the Imperial Guard's telepath, a slight Shi'ar woman whose eyes had gone entirely white since their arrival in this galaxy. A development that the fleet's medical staff was monitoring with academic concern. She herself appeared not to share, spoke, for the first time since the council began. She's not lying, Oracle said. Her primary motivation is genuinely academic. There's something else beneath it, something she's not saying, but the surface is clean. Dorn's voice, when it returned, carried the particular quality of someone recalibrating their assessment of a situation. Your telepath is impressive. The warp hasn't corrupted her yet. Yet, Oracle said quietly, and the word landed in the room with uncomfortable precision. Dorn moved on with the efficiency of a woman who had learned to process uncomfortable truths and continue functioning. The warp exposure your psychers are experiencing is accelerating. I've reviewed the medical reports your communications officer transmitted, deliberately, I suspect, as a gesture of good faith. The symptoms your sensitives are displaying correspond to early stage warp immersion syndrome. Without intervention, you have perhaps 10 days before the weakest among them become liabilities rather than assets. She let that settle. I can provide null field technology, psychic dampeners. They won't eliminate the warp's presence, but they'll create enough interference to slow the progression. In exchange for what? Gladiator asked. Access, Dorn said, to your technology, your navigational data from your home dimension, your biological profiles, and a fractional pause. Complete transparency about any contact you have received from warp entities since your arrival. The council chamber was quiet. Voss looked at Gladiator. Gladiator looked at Oracle. Oracle was looking at nothing visible to anyone else in the room, her white eyes tracking something in the middle distance that had no physical presence. Voss made a decision. We had contact, he said, from a demon prince, Vorathax, who calls himself a servant of Tsench. The silence that followed from Dorn's end of the channel had a texture to it, the particular quality of a highly controlled person encountering information that requires significant internal adjustment. Vorathax the Undying, Dorn said finally, and the name in her voice carried the weight of a file that was very thick and very old. And you're still functional, intact, ideologically, coherent. A pause that contained something that, in a less disciplined person, might have been surprise. What did he offer you? Information, Gladiator said. An observation. He wants to watch what we do. Of course he does, Dorn said, with the weariness of someone who had spent decades dealing with Tsench's agents and their particular brand of detached, intellectual menace. Vorathax has been a variable in Segmentum Obscurus politics for 800 years. He doesn't act. He arranges conditions and watches things unfold. Another pause. The fact that he made direct contact with you rather than operating through intermediaries suggests your fleet has genuinely unsettled his calculations, which means you've already done something no one has managed in several centuries. Surprised him, Smasher said. From her position near the viewport, the youngest of the three guard members present, broad-shouldered and direct, with the straightforward, analytical style of someone who processed complexity by reducing it to load-bearing structures. Is that useful? A surprised Vorathax is a Vorathax who might make mistakes, Dorn said. In 30 years of inquisitorial work, I have never seen Vorathax make a mistake. She let the implication settle. So yes, it's useful. The council continued for another 2 hours, threading careful lines between what could be shared and what couldn't, building the fragile architecture of a relationship between a stranded alien fleet and an inquisitor whose motives were layered enough that Oracle had stopped trying to fully read them and settled for confirming that no immediate betrayal was intended. Dorn transmitted coordinates, a location in the Segmentum Obscurus where a meeting could be arranged, away from Imperial Navy patrol routes, at a decommissioned listening post that officially no longer existed. She also transmitted, as promised, the technical specifications for null field generators, enough to protect the fleet's 8 remaining functional psychers from the worst of the warp's pressure. The fleet's engineering teams began working on them immediately. What Dorn did not transmit, and what she had not mentioned in the council, was what she had found in the secondary analysis of the fleet's arrival data, a pattern in the dimensional mechanics of their transit that the Ordo Xenos, most senior astrophysicists, had been modeling for 11 hours. Since she first accessed the sensor records, the Shi'ar's arrival had not been entirely accidental. The warp storm that had intersected with their Stargate, a phenomenon designated Storm Orantia in Imperial records, a relatively minor and stable warp disturbance that had existed in that region of space for approximately 600 years, had shown, in the hours before the Shi'ar fleet's arrival, behavioral changes consistent with deliberate manipulation. Something had pushed the storm. Something had guided it into contact with the Stargate's dimensional fold at exactly the right moment to create a transit corridor into this universe. Something with extraordinary knowledge of both dimensional mechanics and Shi'ar technology. Something that had known the Eternal Majesty fleet would be conducting exercises at Threshold Corindal on that specific day. Dorn sat alone in her study aboard her personal vessel, reviewing this data for the 3rd time, and arrived at the same conclusion she had reached on the first and second pass. The Shi'ar had not fallen into this galaxy. They had been brought here, and the entity responsible was not Vorathax, whose surprise at their arrival she assessed as genuine, based on 30 years of studying his patterns. It was not the chaos gods, whose attention to detail rarely extended to the mechanics of dimensional engineering. It was something older, something that had been watching the Shi'ar for a very long time, something that had decided, for reasons she could not yet determine, that this galaxy needed something new in it. She closed the file. She opened a different one, older, stranger, its classification level high enough that accessing it had required 3 separate inquisitorial authority codes and a biometric confirmation that included a DNA sample. The file was labeled, in the dry administrative language of the Ordo, Xeno's archive system, entity designation, Eldari legend, the one who watches, cross-reference, dimensional insertion events, historical. She began to read. The craft world came out of the void like a thought-made architecture. It was enormous, not in the blunt, aggressive way of imperial vessels, which achieved scale through the simple accumulation of mass, but in the way of something grown rather than built, its surfaces flowing with organic curves and bioluminescent tracery that pulsed in, rhythms too complex to be mechanical and too regular to be accidental. Craft world Ulthwi, ancient beyond any Shi'ar reference for the word ancient, home to hundreds of thousands of Eldari souls and the accumulated psychic weight of a civilization that had existed for longer than humanity had walked upright, emerged from a controlled warp transit point 12,000 kilometers off the eternal Majesty Fleet's port bow with the unhurried confidence of something that had been exactly where it intended to be for quite some time. It had not appeared on any sensor until it chose to. Admiral Voss stared at his display with the expression of a man updating his threat assessment models in real time. How long was it there before it decloaked? Tessavel checked her readings twice before answering. Based on residual energy signatures, approximately 9 hours, Admiral. 9 hours. The craft world had been sitting 12,000 kilometers away, watching the Shi'ar fleet, listening to their council with Inquisitor Dorn, monitoring their engineering teams, installing null field generators. For 9 hours. And the most sophisticated sensor suite in the Shi'ar Imperial Navy had detected nothing. Voss filed this information in the category labeled things that should not be possible and moved on, because the 41st millennium was rapidly proving itself to be a category with no practical upper limit. The hailing signal from Ulthwi was unlike anything the fleet's communications systems had previously processed. It arrived not through conventional subspace frequencies, but through a channel that the null field generators, installed specifically to dampen psychic interference, had to partially lower their output to allow through. Oracle, sitting at the communications console, with her wide eyes and her careful mental barriers, caught the signal's nature before the translation matrix finished processing it and turned to Gladiator with an expression that was several things simultaneously. It's psychic, she said. The transmission, not a carrier wave with a psychic component. The signal itself is psychic, pure thought, structured into linguistic form. She paused. It's the cleanest, most precise psionic communication I have ever encountered. Whoever is transmitting has control that makes everything I can do look like amateur performance. Can you receive it safely? Gladiator asked. Oracle considered this for a moment with the particular care of someone assessing a high-voltage cable they've been asked to touch. Safely is relative, she said. But yes. She opened herself to the signal, what she received, and translated, haltingly, into Shi'ar, standard for the bridge crew, was a voice that carried the texture of enormous age without any of the weight that age usually imposed on communication. It was light, precise, faintly, amused in the way of someone who had lived long enough to find most situations more interesting than alarming. Travelers from beyond the veil, the voice said, in Oracle's translation. You have been in our galaxy for less than one of your standard days, and you have already spoken with a demon, an inquisitor, and the remnants of a human naval engagement. You move quickly for people who have no idea where they are. Voss leaned forward. Can we respond? Oracle nodded and shaped the response psionically, a process that visibly cost her effort. We are attempting to understand our situation. We welcome communication with any party willing to provide it. A pause that felt considered rather than hesitant. Understanding your situation, the voice returned, will require that you first accept something your science will resist. This galaxy is not governed only by physics. The dimension you call subspace, and we call the warp, is not an energy field or a navigational medium. It is a living ecosystem of psychic entities. And your fleet has arrived in it the way a new scent arrives in a room full of predators. Everything here is already aware of you. Most of it is deciding whether you are food. We are aware of the warp's nature, Oracle transmitted. We are taking precautions. Your precautions, the voice said, with the gentle precision of a teacher, correcting a student who has understood the principle, but missed the application, are addressing the symptoms. I am offering to address the cause. The farcer who had transmitted this introduction, whose name translated approximately as Thalindra, of the Black Library, a designation that meant nothing to the Shi'ar but caused Inquisitor Dorn, monitoring the exchange from her, listening post coordinates through the channel she'd left open, to sit forward so sharply she knocked a data slate off her desk, came aboard the Resplendent. Well, 3 hours later, she came alone, in a transport so small it was barely larger than the Shi'ar shuttle Gladiator had taken to meet Vorithax, and she walked through the Resplendent, Will's docking bay with the unhurried self-possession of someone for whom personal safety was a consideration so thoroughly resolved it no longer required active thought. She was tall for an Eldari, which made her approximately Shi'ar average, with the angular features and enormous eyes of her species, wearing the rune-covered body glove of a farcer and carrying a witchblade that hummed with contained psychic energy at a frequency the null field generators registered and carefully did not interfere with. Her hair was the silver white of extreme age, worn loose, and her eyes were the deep violet of the warp-touched Eldari, not corrupted, not damaged, but permanently marked by a lifetime of looking into the galaxy's psychic substrate and seeing what lived there. She looked at Oracle first. The two telepaths regarded each other for a moment with the professional assessment of specialists recognizing equivalent training in a different tradition. Your barriers are excellent, Thalindra said. And spoken, Shi'ar standard that the translation matrix handled with no perceptible lag. For someone who has never been formally trained in warp resistance techniques, you have survived 6 days of full exposure. With remarkable structural integrity, a fractional pause. You will not survive another 6 without guidance. Oracle held her gaze. Are you offering guidance? I am offering to explain what is happening to your sensitives and why. Yes. Thalindra looked then at Gladiator, a look that lasted slightly longer than the others and contained. Gladiator noted with his characteristic precision something that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. Some recognition, or near recognition, that she filed away without comment. Then she looked at Voss. Admiral, you have been in communication with an Inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos. I would like to suggest that while Inquisitor Dorn's intentions toward your fleet are not hostile, her analysis of your situation is incomplete. Voss gestured toward the briefing room. Then let's sit down. What followed was 2 hours of the most concentrated xenological and metaphysical education the Shi'ar fleet's senior staff had ever received. Thalindra explained the warp with the patient clarity of someone who had spent centuries teaching its nature to students who needed frameworks their existing knowledge couldn't provide. She explained the chaos gods, not as supernatural entities to be feared, but as ecological phenomena to be understood, emergent properties of a psychic ecosystem that had been developing for longer than most of the galaxy's current civilizations had existed. She explained the Eldari fall, the catastrophic psychic event that had shaped their civilization's entire subsequent history, with a brevity that contained multitudes of grief. And then she explained something that none of the fleet's intelligence gathering had produced. Your arrival was not accidental, she said, in the particular tone of someone delivering information they have carefully considered whether to share. The warp storm that intersected your transit gate was manipulated. The timing was precise, to a degree that excludes coincidence. She looked at the table's surface for a moment, then back up. The entity responsible is one we call the Laughing God, Segarak, the last of the Eldari gods to survive the fall, existing now within the warp itself. beyond the reach of Slaanesh. She paused. He is a trickster, not malevolent, or not straightforwardly malevolent. But his designs are rarely comprehensible until they have fully unfolded. Why would a warp entity want us here? Voss asked. Thalindra looked at him with eyes that had seen 10,000 years of this galaxy's history. That is precisely the question, she said. And the fact that I do not know. The answer is the most alarming thing. I can tell you. She set her hands flat on the table, a gesture that, across species boundaries, carried the universal weight of something serious being placed directly before someone. Segarak does not act without reason. He does not move pieces on the board without knowing what game is being played. She looked at Gladiator again, with that same near recognition. I have been consulting the skein, the web of probability that Farseers used to navigate possible futures since your fleet arrived. Most paths lead to destruction, for you and for others. Most, Gladiator said. Most, Thalindra confirmed. There are a small number of paths that lead elsewhere. They are narrow. They require choices that are counterintuitive from a military standpoint. She looked at him steadily. They all require you specifically, Praetor, which is why I came. The nullfield generators hummed in the walls. Outside the viewports, the craft world Ulfwe hung in the dark, vast and patient, its bioluminescent surfaces pulsing with the slow rhythms of hundreds of thousands of dreaming Eldari souls. In her quarters, Miravel soon was awake again. The voice from the warp quieter, now behind the null field dampening, but not absent. Never absent. She sat with her knees to her chest and listened to it with the careful discipline of someone who had decided that understanding what was being said was safer than refusing to hear it. It was telling her something about Gladiator, about what he was, in this galaxy's terms, about why Thalindra had looked at him that way, about why Segarak had brought them all here. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and tried to decide whether the right thing to do was tell someone immediately, or wait until she was certain she hadn't simply lost her mind. The voice, patient and vast and entirely too reasonable in tone for what it was, suggested she take her time. The Tyranids arrived without announcement, as they always did, because announcement was a concept that belonged to civilizations. With something to say, the first indication was a sensor ghost, a flicker at the edge of the fleet's long-range detection range that Tessavel logged as a possible anomaly and flagged for secondary analysis. The second indication, arriving 40 seconds later, was the complete failure of every long-range sensor in the fleet simultaneously, as though the space beyond a certain radius had simply stopped containing information. The third indication was Thalindra standing up from the briefing table with the controlled urgency of someone who has just heard a sound that every instinct they possess classifies as run. Shadow in the warp, she said, and the four words carried more concentrated alarm than anything she had said in 2 hours of careful, measured briefing. A hive fleet, close, far closer than your sensors showed. They were masking their approach in the shadow. She was already moving toward the door. Admiral, you need to go to battle stations immediately, not as a precaution, as a fact. Voss was already on the comm. The resplendent Wills battle station. Klaxons began their cycle before Thalindra reached the doorway. What the sensors showed, once the fleet's tactical teams recalibrated for the specific frequency blinding effect of the Tyranid shadow in the warp, a phenomenon that Thalindra explained in 30 seconds of clipped essential detail as they moved toward the bridge, was a hive fleet splinter force of approximately 400 bioships, ranging in size from drone ship escorts, barely larger than Shi'ar fighters, to two hive ships at the formation's core, each 1 kilometer long, each one a living vessel of chitin and muscle and weaponized biology that the Shi'ar sensor suite could not entirely classify because its hull materials contained no metal, no composite alloy, nothing that corresponded to any constructed warship in their reference database. They were alive. The ships were alive, not in the metaphorical sense that sailors sometimes used for vessels they loved, but literally, biologically, metabolically alive, breathing, circulating, processing, directing. Every function of the fleet coordinated through a psychic network that connected each organism to the hive minds. vast and ancient will with a completeness that made the Borg collective, had any Shi'ar present known of them, look like a loose federation of independent contractors by comparison. Gladiator stood at the bridge viewport and looked at the approaching bioships with the focused stillness of a man running calculations. They're not targeting us specifically, Oracle said. From the communications console, she was reading the Tyranid approach, with her psychic senses rather than the sensor suite, feeling the shape of the hive. Mine's attention the way a swimmer feels a current. They're responding to biomass. We're just the largest collection of organic material in their current feeding range. She paused. That's not reassuring. I know that's not reassuring, but it's accurate. It means they're not coordinating an attack based on our tactical profile. Gladiator said. It means they're hungry, not strategic. He turned to Voss. Different problem. Felindra had taken a position at a secondary console, moving with the practiced ease of someone who had worked with alien technology before and was capable of rapid adaptation. The shadow and the warp your sensitives have been experiencing will intensify as the hive fleet closes, she said, her fingers moving across the console's interface with cautious precision. The null field generators will provide some protection, but not complete. The hive mind's psychic mass at this proximity will begin to press through any dampening field short of a full Geller field, maintained at warship strength. She looked at Voss. Your psychers need to be sedated or shielded before the fleet closes to engagement range. All of them, including Oracle. Oracle looked up. I'm functional. You are functional now, Felindra said, with the gentle implacability of someone who had watched this process before. When the shadow intensifies, the warp becomes very loud and very simple. It removes complexity and leaves only the hive minds will. Your barriers will hold for a time. Then they will not. She held Oracle's wide-eyed gaze. I have watched stronger telepaths than you break against the shadow. I say this not to diminish you, but to prevent you from making a decision based on pride, rather than survival. Oracle was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she nodded once and began the procedure for voluntary sedation, with the calm efficiency of someone doing a difficult thing correctly. The engagement began 6 minutes later. The Tyranids did not use the measured, sequential tactics of the Imperial Navy or the calculated maneuvering the Shi'ar fleet had trained against. They attacked the way weather attacks, omnidirectionally, with the complete absence of ego or strategy, driven by appetite and the hive minds. Instinctive optimization for biomass acquisition. Bioplasma barges lit the void in colors that the Shi'ar sensor suite identified as consistent with directed high energy plasma discharge, but that moved with an organic unpredictability that their targeting algorithms struggled to compensate for. Spore mine clouds dispersed ahead of the main fleet in patterns that looked random until the Shi'ar cruisers began maneuvering to avoid the plasma barges and found the mine fields exactly where their evasive vectors had taken them. The hive mind did not think the way the Shi'ar thought. It did not plan. It adapted instantly, continuously, without the lag of command structures or communication delays. A single vast intelligence updating its entire tactical approach in real time. As new data arrived, every ship in the fleet an extension of a single will that processed 400 vessels worth of sensor data simultaneously and adjusted accordingly. Against this, the Shi'ar fleet's tactical sophistication was simultaneously their greatest asset and a source of unexpected vulnerability. Their targeting systems were precise, more precise than anything the Tyranids had encountered in this region of the galaxy. Their energy weapons cut through chitin and biomatter with clinical efficiency. Their point defense grids handled the spore mine approach, vectors with a competence that bought time. They were, by individual ship and individual weapons system, significantly more capable than the Imperial vessels that typically faced Tyranid incursions. But they had never fought anything that didn't respond to damage the way ships responded to damage. When a Shi'ar cruiser's shields failed and its hull was breached, the crew responded with emergency protocols, damage control, structured triage. When a Tyranid bioship was gutted by an energy strike that would have crippled any Shi'ar vessel, it responded by sealing the wound with living tissue in seconds, rerouting biological functions around the damage. and continuing its attack. Vector with the cheerful indifference to injury of something that experienced pain as information rather than deterrent. Gladiator left the bridge at the 7-minute mark. He didn't announce it. He simply walked to the docking bay, took the personal transit pod that the Imperial Guard used for rapid deployment, and launched into the engagement space between the fleets. He hit the first bioship, a mid-sized, Kraken-class organism approximately 800 meters long, at a velocity he'd been building for 40 seconds of open space acceleration, leading with both fists in the manner of a being who had learned that initial impact was a statement of intent, as much as a tactical choice. The impact registered on the resplendent Will's external sensors as an energy discharge consistent with a low-yield warhead detonation. The bioship's forward section crumpled. It veered off its attack vector. It did not, despite the damage, stop. Gladiator tore into its hull with his hands. What followed was not elegant. It was not the kind of combat that produced clean tactical assessments. It was the oldest kind of violence, direct, immediate, physical, a being of extraordinary power engaging in organism of extraordinary resilience in the most basic possible terms. The bioship's interior was warm and wet and completely alien. Its defensive biology, responding to the intruder with processes that had evolved over millions of years of consuming everything the galaxy had presented for consumption. It had never presented anything like Gladiator. He worked through 3 bioships in 11 minutes, each engagement buying the fleet 30 to 40 seconds of reduced pressure on that vector as the hive mind recalculated around the anomalous variable of a single organism dismantling its vessels by hand. The recalculation itself was informative. The Shi'ar tactical team, watching Gladiator's engagement pattern on external sensors, noticed that the hive mind shifted resources to compensate for him, specifically rather than simply absorbing the losses, which meant his presence was registering as a priority, variable rather than acceptable attrition. It's trying to figure out what he is, Tessaville said, with the wondering tone of someone making a scientific observation. In the middle of a crisis, the hive mind is actually confused. Felindra looked up from the console where she had been working since the engagement began, entering calculations with focused speed. That is not something I have observed before, she said, and her voice carried the particular quality of a statement that was simultaneously reassuring and deeply significant. She had been watching Gladiator's engagement with an expression that had settled into a careful, private certainty, the look of someone whose hypothesis was being confirmed at considerable cost to their composure. The thing she had seen when she first looked at Gladiator, the near recognition, the reason Segarak had brought them here. She was certain of it now. She returned to her calculations, moving faster, because the Hive Fleet Splinter Force was the problem immediately in front of them, and Gladiator was handling it with the brutal competence of someone born to exactly this kind of work. But Thalindra had been reading the skein since the engagement began, tracking the probability threads that branched from each decision, each action, each moment of the fight. And in the skein, she could see what was coming behind the Tyranids. Not another enemy. Something stranger than that. Something that the Tyranids' arrival had, intentionally or otherwise, delayed the Shi'ar fleet from moving away from. A phenomenon at the edge of the skein's reliable vision. Vast and ancient and utterly indifferent to the organic drama playing out in its proximity. Necron tomb ships, 17 of them, stirred from a 60 million year sleep by the psychic disruption of the Shi'ar fleet's arrival and the subsequent warp activity of their interactions with Demon, Inquisitor, and Farser, awakening, slowly, with the inexorable patience of things that had been waiting since before humanity learned to use fire. In a tomb complex 3 light minutes away, she had perhaps 4 hours to prepare the Shi'ar. For what that meant, she wasn't certain 4 hours was enough. The Necrons did not hurry. This was, in its own way, more frightening than the Tyranids had been. The Tyranids were appetite, vast, relentless, but comprehensible in the way that hunger was comprehensible, following vectors that could be read and countered, and survived if the countering was precise enough. The Tyranids wanted to consume. That was a motivation that corresponded to something in the experiential vocabulary of every living thing that had ever existed. The Necrons wanted nothing. Or rather, and Thalindra spent 20 minutes attempting to convey this distinction to Admiral Voss and his senior staff in terms that their framework could accommodate. They wanted something so ancient and so alien to organic cognition that the word want was functionally misleading. They had woken because something had disturbed their sleep. They would now assess the disturbance. If the disturbance constituted a threat to their tomb complex, they would eliminate it. If it did not, they would return to their sleep. The assessment process would be conducted with the complete, unhurried thoroughness of beings for whom time was not a resource, but a medium, something they existed within rather than something they spent. They have no ego, Thalindra said, in the briefing room where Voss had convened his command staff. Between the end of the Tyranid engagement and the beginning of whatever came next, Gladiator had returned from the engagement with Tyranid ichor drying on his uniform and a cut along his jaw that was already closing. One of the Hive fleet's larger warrior organisms had gotten close enough to demonstrate that even Strontian physiology had limits that sufficiently determined alien biology could approach. He had cleaned up with the efficiency of someone for whom personal maintenance was a brief, practical matter and taken his position at the table without comment on his injuries. They have no politics, no theology, no grudges in the way you experience grudges. If you demonstrate that you are not a threat to their physical domain, they may simply stop, return to dormancy, as though you never existed. And if we can't demonstrate that, Voss asked, then they will disassemble your fleet. With the same emotional investment a groundskeeper applies to removing weeds, Thalindra said, thoroughly, without malice, without any of the hesitation that comes from valuing the thing being destroyed. She paused. They are the only faction in this galaxy that I would describe as genuinely impartial. They do not hate you. They do not fear you. They do not want anything from you. They will simply calculate your status, threat or non-threat, and act accordingly. Smasher, who had been listening, with the focused stillness she applied to problems she was building a structural understanding of, spoke. So the solution is to communicate non-threat status before they complete their assessment. Precisely, Thalindra said. How do you communicate non-threat status to something that has no language for negotiation? Smasher pressed. Thalindra looked at her for a moment. You don't negotiate, she said. You demonstrate. Through behavior, through positioning, through the specific absence of actions they would classify as aggressive. She looked at Gladiator, which means that what you did against the Tyranids, necessary, effective, and strategically sound is precisely the behavioral profile the Necrons will have been monitoring. Their awakening assessment will have begun the moment you arrived. They have been watching everything. Gladiator absorbed this. They watched us fight the Tyranids. They watched you fight the Tyranids, Thalindra confirmed. And the precision of the pronoun was deliberate. You specifically, a single organism dismantling bioships with its hands, operating at energy output, levels their instruments will have registered as anomalous. She met his gaze with the look she'd been carrying since the first briefing, the near recognition that had solidified during the Tyranid engagement into something she had clearly decided required direct address. Praetor, I need to tell you something that you may find difficult to accept. The briefing room was very quiet. In Eldari myth, Thalindra said carefully, there is a concept, not a prophecy, exactly, but a recurring pattern in the skein that farsers have observed across thousands of years of probability reading. We call it the shining anomaly, an entity from outside the galaxy's established order, outside its psychic ecosystem, outside its factional histories, outside the warp's accumulated weight, whose presence creates a possibility, space that doesn't otherwise exist. Not a savior, not a weapon, a catalyst, something whose nature is foreign enough to the galaxies, established patterns that it opens, paths that were previously closed. She paused. I believe you are the shining anomaly. I believe this is why Segarak brought your fleet here. Gladiator was quiet for a long moment. Around the table, the senior staff processed this with varying degrees of visible reaction. Voss with the careful neutrality of a commander separating the emotionally significant from the tactically relevant. Saville with the scientific excitement of someone encountering a framework that explained several anomalous data points. Simultaneously, driven with the pragmatic skepticism of a tactical officer who had learned to be suspicious of narratives that centered on a single individual. What does a catalyst do? Gladiator asked finally. It changes the conditions of a reaction without being consumed by it. Thylindra said. In this context, your presence creates the possibility of outcomes that this galaxy cannot produce on its own. The Imperium's stagnation, the Eldar's decline, the Chaos God's eternal feeding cycle. These are not individual problems. They are a system, a closed loop, that has been grinding toward entropy for 10,000 years. Something from outside the system, with no stake in its established dynamics, no history in its conflicts, no debt to its factions. She stopped. Do you understand what I'm saying? You're saying I can do things here that no one who belongs here can do. Gladiator said. Because I don't carry the weight of what this place has been. Yes, Thylindra said. And Segarak knew this. Segarak, she said, with the particular tone of someone discussing a being whose relationship with ethics was architectural rather than moral, knows a great many things. His methods are rarely comfortable for the people who find themselves inside them. The discussion of the Necron approach, strategy that followed was thorough and technically demanding, and it produced a plan that Voss assessed as carrying approximately a 40% chance of successful non-engagement resolution, which Thylindra noted was significantly better than the standard odds against a fully awakened Necron tomb complex, which she placed at approximately 0. The plan required the fleet to reposition into a specific formation that Thylindra calculated as maximally non-threatening to Necron's spatial assessment protocols, power down all active weapon systems while maintaining shields, and transmit a specific sequence of energy pulses on frequencies that Necron instruments would read as a particular kind of signal, not a greeting, not a surrender, something more precise, a declaration of transient status. We are passing through. We have no claim on this space. We acknowledge your dominion. They will still scan us, Thylindra said. In detail, they will analyze every ship, every crew member, every technology system. The scanning process itself is non-harmful but intrusive. Your crew will experience it as a sensation of being observed, comprehensively, coldly, without any of the warmth that observation from a living consciousness carries. She looked around the table. Prepare your people for that. What she did not say, because the briefing had already carried enough weight and because some information was better delivered privately, was what she had seen in the scan regarding the scanning process specifically. The Necrons would scan everything, yes. And in scanning Gladiator, their instruments would register what she had seen in her first look at him, the energy profile, that is Strontian physiology, produced at full output, the specific frequency of his bioelectric field, the characteristics of his cellular structure under stress, characteristics that matched, with a precision that she was still working to understand, a pattern in Necron records that predated their 60 million year sleep, a pattern associated with beings the Necrons had encountered in the galaxy's deep prehistory, before the war in heaven, before the Tan, before the Necronters' terrible bargain with the star gods. A pattern that some fragment of Necron collective memory had retained across 60 million years of dormancy and would recognize instantly upon scanning. The Necrons had a word for what Gladiator's energy profile resembled. Thylindra had found it in the Black Library's deepest archives, in texts so old that even the Eldari had largely forgotten their context. The word translated, approximately, as herald. She needed to understand what that meant before the Necrons completed their assessment, because the implications branched in the skein into two possibilities with almost nothing between them. In one, the herald designation caused the Necrons to stand down, to classify the Shi'ar fleet as something outside their threat matrix entirely, something their ancient protocols instructed them to leave alone. In the other, it caused the Necrons to escalate beyond anything the fleet could survive, because the last time their records showed a herald in this galaxy, it had been immediately before an event that their archives described only as the first unmaking. Thylindra sat in a small side room off the main corridor and worked through the Black Library texts with the focused desperation of a scholar racing a deadline. her witchblade resting across her knees. Its hum a familiar comfort against the cold weight of what she was reading. Outside, the Necron tomb. Ships moved through the dark, with the patient certainty of things that had already decided what they were going to do. They were 3 hours away. In the fleet's medical bay, Miravel soon, cleared by the ship's doctor as stable. The null field, generators having reduced her symptoms to manageable levels, sat up in her bunk and asked, very quietly, if she could speak to the farser. She had been listening to the warp's voice for 6 days. She had been filtering it, resisting it, maintaining her barriers against it with everything her training provided. But in the last 12 hours, since the Tyranid engagement, since Thalindra's words about the shining anomaly, since Gladiator had returned from the void with alien blood drying on his uniform and something in his expression that she couldn't name, the voice had changed. It wasn't pushing anymore. It was waiting. And in that waiting, she had finally been able to hear what it had been trying to tell her from the beginning. Not a corruption, not a seduction, not the predatory whispering she'd been braced against. Something that felt, despite everything she knew about where it came from and what it was, almost like a warning. She needed to tell Thalindra. She needed to tell Gladiator. She needed to tell someone that the warp, the vast, ancient, predatory, psychic ecosystem that had been pressing against her mind for 6 days, was afraid. Not of the Necrons, not of the Imperium, not of anything outside itself. Of what happened if the Herald fulfilled the pattern. The Necron tomb. Ships crossed the 3-hour threshold in 2 hours and 40 minutes. Either Thalindra's calculation had been optimistic, or the Necrons had decided that their assessment of the disturbance warranted acceleration and acceleration. For beings that experience time as a medium rather than a resource, meant something had changed in their evaluation. Something had shifted the calculus from measured investigation to active response. Tessavel identified the trigger 11 minutes before the tomb. Ships crossed into engagement range, pulling it from the sensor. Data with the focused intensity of someone who had been running continuous analysis since the Necrons first appeared on the fleets. Reconstructed long-range picture. Energy spike from the tomb complex, she said, her voice carrying the particular flatness of a scientist reporting. A result that has surprised them past the point of emotional reaction. Not weapons charging, not drive systems. It's a communication pulse, outbound, extremely low frequency, broadcasting on a band our instruments can barely register. She looked up. Something answered it. From outside the system. Something much larger. Voss stared at the display. How much larger? Tessavel checked her readings with the expression of someone hoping the second check would produce a different result. The return signal's origin point is approximately 4 light hours away. The source's mass displacement registers as she stopped. Tessavel. A Necron tomb world, Admiral. A full tomb world. Not a splinter force. Not an outpost. She set her hands flat on the console in an unconscious echo of Thalindra's gesture from the earlier briefing. The tomb ships woke up and called home. The briefing room, where Thalindra and Miravel soon had been in urgent conversation for 40 minutes, went very quiet when this information arrived. Thalindra received it with the contained stillness of someone integrating a result that confirmed a feared hypothesis. Miravel, sitting across from her, with her hands wrapped around a cup of something warm that she wasn't drinking, watched the farser's face and read the confirmation in it before anyone spoke. The Herald pattern, Miravel said. Not a question. Thalindra looked at her with the particular attention she had been giving the young telepath since Miravel had asked to speak with her, the attention of a farser encountering a mind that had been doing, through raw instinct and desperate necessity, something that approximated what farsers spent decades learning. Yes, she said. They've identified it. The local force's recognition triggered an automatic protocol, escalating the contact to a higher authority in the Necron hierarchy. She was already standing, moving. We need Gladiator. Now. They found him on the observation deck. He was standing where he had stood at the beginning of all of this, arms folded behind his back, looking out at the alien stars, the same position he'd occupied when the first Imperial Navy signals appeared on the sensors. But something had changed in the quality of his stillness since then. The wrongness that had pressed against his cells from the moment of arrival had not diminished. The null field generators helped the psychers But Gladiator's sensitivity was physiological rather than psychic. Something in his Strontian biology that resonated with this universe's particular frequency of wrongness. Without being consumed by it, he had been feeling it for 6 days. He had stopped fighting it approximately 2 days ago and started listening to it instead. The Necrons called for reinforcement, he said, without turning around. I know. I felt the pulse. Felindra stopped beside him. For a moment, the three of them, the Strontian warrior, the ancient farcer, and the exhausted Shi'ar telepath, stood looking at the stars in silence. Tell me what the Herald designation means, Gladiator said. All of it, not the diplomatic version. Felindra was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she told him. The Herald pattern, in the oldest Necron records that the Black Library preserved, corresponded to a category of being that the Necronter had encountered in the galaxy's deep prehistory, entities from outside the galaxies, established order whose arrival preceded transformative events, not always destructive transformations, not always beneficial ones. Transformations in the most fundamental sense, changes to the galaxy's basic condition that altered the trajectories of everything within it. The Necrons had no theology, but they had history, 60 million years of it, compressed into crystalline data cores that their tomb ships carried as essential operating parameters. And in that history, the appearance of a herald had never been an isolated event. It had always been a beginning. A beginning of what? Gladiator asked. That varied, Felindra said carefully. In 2 recorded instances, the herald's presence coincided with the resolution of conflicts that had been locked in stalemate for geological timescales. The conditions the herald created allowed equilibria to shift. She paused. In one instance, the herald's presence preceded an extinction event on a scale that the Necrons classified as total within a radius of several hundred light years. What was the difference? Miravel asked. Between the resolution and the extinction? Felindra looked at her. The choices the herald made, she said. What they did with the space their presence opened. Gladiator turned from the viewport. His expression was the one that his Imperial Guard colleagues recognized as his deepest operational mode, not the aggressive certainty that powered his combat effectiveness, but something quieter and more fundamental. The thing beneath the confidence. The actual Calarch, looking at a problem that his strength alone couldn't resolve and deciding how to use what else he had. What do the Necrons want? He asked. Specifically, not the threat assessment. What does the Herald designation mean for their protocols regarding us? They want to witness the beginning, Felindra said. In Necron terms, they want to be present for whatever the Herald initiates. Their protocols don't specify intervention. They specify observation and, in some readings of the ancient texts, facilitation. She met his gaze directly. They may not be here to destroy you, Praetor. They may be here to watch you do something. Then we need to give them something to watch, Gladiator said. What he proposed took 11 minutes to explain and produced, in the faces of everyone who heard it, a sequence of reactions that moved through skepticism, recognition, reluctant acknowledgement, an arrival at a place that wasn't quite hope but was structurally adjacent to it. It required the cooperation of every faction they had contacted. It required Felindra to open a channel to the craft world that she had been maintaining carefully closed to preserve, negotiating distance. It required Inquisitor Dorn to do something that would cost her considerably within the Inquisition's internal politics, and it required Vorithax, whose vessel had been shadowing the fleet at a distance of 50,000 kilometers since the Tyranid engagement, because its Scientian, demon-watching events unfold was simply an environmental condition at this point, rather than a tactical consideration, to act on his stated interest in the Shi'ar's unpredictability in a way that carried real cost. It required, at its center, Gladiator to fly directly to the lead Necron tomb ship alone, not to fight, not to negotiate in any conventional sense, to do something that Felindra had suggested was theoretically possible based on her Black Library research and that she assessed, with the careful honesty that had characterized everything she'd said since coming aboard, as having a 30% chance of working, a 40% chance of producing an ambiguous result, and a 30% chance of causing the tomb ships to open fire immediately. to demonstrate, in terms the Necron's ancient protocols would recognize. What kind of herald had arrived? The Necrons recorded their encounters with heralds in two primary classifications. The first was what they called the Sundering Herald, an entity whose presence created change through destruction, whose nature was fundamentally incompatible with the galaxy's established order and whose passage left transformation through the elimination of what existed before. The second was what they called the Mending Herald, an entity whose presence created change through integration, whose nature was foreign enough to the galaxy's patterns to see past its established conflicts and whose passage left transformation through the connection of what had been separate. The distinction in Necron assessment protocol was determined by a single behavioral test when presented with the most fundamental conflict in its immediate environment, the deepest, oldest, most intractable opposition between forces that had been locked in opposition for the longest. What did the Herald do? Gladiator flew to the lead tomb ship alone. In his transit pod, weapons offline, broadcasting on the frequency Thylindra had specified. The tomb ship was 6 kilometers of living metal, its hull shifting in the slow patterns of active Necron systems, its surface covered in the geometric precision of a civilization that had existed when the galaxy's current dominant species were still amino acids in a primordial sea. It did not fire on him. It opened. He walked through corridors of silver-green metal that shifted around him, the tomb ship's interior reconfiguring in real time to accommodate his movement in a way that was either menacing or welcoming, depending on the interpretive framework applied. The air was cold and carried no scent. The light came from the metal itself. There were Necron warriors in the corridors, tall, skeletal, their Gauss weapons held in carry positions rather than raised, watching him pass with the empty green luminescence of their optical sensors. And he met each set of eyes as he passed, because looking away was the wrong behavioral signal, and he had briefed himself thoroughly on Necron behavioral cues in the 40 minutes between Thylindra's revelation and his departure. The chamber at the tomb ship's center was vast and geometric, and occupied by a single figure, a Necron overlord, taller than the warriors, its form carrying the additional complexity of a high-status Necron whose physical configuration had been elaborated over millions of years into something that sat at the border between machine and abstraction. It looked at Gladiator with the empty patience of deep time, and Gladiator looked back. He reached, with the careful precision of someone performing an action they have rehearsed once and must execute correctly the first time, into the interior pocket of his uniform and removed a data core, Shi'ar manufacture, loaded with everything the fleet's intelligence teams had assembled on the Necron civilization, on the Imperium, on the Warp, on the Eldari, on the Tyranids, on everything they had encountered since arriving in this galaxy. Every sensor reading, every communication intercept, every analysis, everything the Shi'ar knew about where they were and what was happening around them. He held it out to the Overlord, not as a bargaining chip, not as intelligence to be traded for safety, as a gift, the complete and unconditional sharing of everything a stranger knew, offered to an ancient intelligence by someone who had decided that the galaxy's oldest problem was not power or conflict or entropy, but the profound, catastrophic failure of its inhabitants to show one another what they actually saw. The Overlord looked at the data core for a long moment. Then it reached out and took it. In the skein, Thylindra felt the probability threads shift with a violence that made her grip her console for physical support, not the gradual adjustment of incremental change, but the sudden wholesale restructuring of a future that had been locked in one configuration for longer than most civilizations had existed. The Necron's ancient protocols had their answer. Mending Herald, the Necron Overlord's name, translated through a linguistic framework so ancient that Thylindra's Black Library text could only approximate it, was something that rendered in Shi'ar standard as Zareka's Echo, a designation that carried, in its original Necronter form, connotations of memory and continuity, and the specific quality of a thing that persisted, because it remembered what had been lost. It had been dormant for 60 million years. It had woken to find its galaxy unrecognizable, and it had just received from the hands of a being whose energy profile matched the oldest pattern in its operational memory, a complete record of what that galaxy had become. It spent 4 hours reading the data core. During those 4 hours, Gladiator remained in the chamber at the tomb ship's center, standing with the patient stillness of someone who had learned that certain moments required witness rather than action. The Necron warriors in the corridors outside did not move. The tomb ships in the void outside did not advance. The galaxy, in that specific volume of space, held its breath in the way that only spaces containing very old things and very consequential decisions can. Aboard the resplendent well, the weight was experienced differently by different people. Voss stood at the bridge viewport with the controlled tension of a commander who had sent his most irreplaceable asset into a situation with a 30% chance of immediate destruction and was now doing the hardest thing command ever required, waiting for information he couldn't influence. Tessavel ran continuous sensor analysis on the tomb ship's energy profiles, looking for any fluctuation that might indicate a shift toward weapons activation, and found none. Draven ran tactical simulations for the 30% scenario with the dedicated pessimism of a man who believed in preparing for the worst while hoping for the best, and found that none of the simulations produced outcomes he was comfortable with. Oracle, recovering in the medical bay from her voluntary sedation, woke partway through the 4 hours and lay quietly in her bunk, her white eyes open, feeling the shape of things with her recovering psychic senses. She felt the warp's continued presence, reduced now behind the null field generators too, something she could observe, rather than drown in, a vast and ancient pressure that she had come to understand as simply a feature of this universe, like gravity or electromagnetic radiation, requiring management rather than terror. She felt the distant shape of the craft world Ulthwi, its psychic mass warm and complex and enormously old. She felt Miravel soon, 2 decks below, sleeping properly for the first time since their arrival, the exhausted sleep of someone whose burden had been partially shared. And she felt something else, something she had no framework for, something that had no corresponding sensation in any psychic experience her training covered. It was coming from the direction of the Necron tomb ship, not a psychic signal. The Necrons produced no psychic signature, their living metal existences sitting outside the warp's perceptual range entirely, which was both their greatest defense against chaos and one of the fundamental tragedies of what they had sacrificed in their bargain with the Tan. What Oracle felt was the absence of something that had been present since their arrival, a pressure she had been filtering so continuously she had stopped registering it as distinct from the background. The galaxies held breath, releasing. Zareka's echo looked up from the data core at the 4-hour mark, its optical sensors fixed on Gladiator with the empty luminescence that was the closest to Necron. Overlord came to an expression. When it spoke, the sound it produced was not organic. It was the resonance of metal structured to produce language, a voice like the inside of a vast machine, remembering that it once had something to say. The words it produced were not in any living language. They were in Necronter, the original language of the species before the biotransference, dead for 60 million years, preserved only in the deepest archives of Necron data cores and the most ancient sections of the Black Library. Thalindra, monitoring through a channel Gladiator, was transmitting back to the fleet, recognized enough to translate the shape of it, if not every specific word. What Zareka's echo said, approximately, was this: the pattern is confirmed. The mending herald stands in the place of choosing. The tomb bears witness. We will not impede the beginning. And then, with the unhurried certainty of things that had already decided, what do you require? Gladiator had prepared for many possible responses from the Necron overlord. He had prepared for silence, for weapons fire, for the incomprehensible, geometric responses that Thalindra had warned him Necron communication sometimes produced. He had not entirely prepared for a direct offer of assistance from a 60-million-year-old machine intelligence, because there were limits to what even thorough briefing could cover. He recovered in approximately 2 seconds, which was, under the circumstances, impressive. A path, he said. Safe transit through your territory. Long enough for our fleet to reach a stable position from which we can pursue our primary objective. Your primary objective, the Overlord said. The translated approximation. Carrying a quality that might have been confirmation rather than question. Going home, Gladiator said. And before we go, doing something useful with the space. Our presence has opened. What followed was not a negotiation. It was more like a briefing between professionals who had agreed on the objective and were working out the operational details. Zareka's Echo provided safe transit corridors through Necron space, a gift of extraordinary practical value. Since Necron territory in the Segmentum Obscurus was a region that Imperial chaos and Tyranid forces all avoided with the reverence given to things that had demonstrated lethal indifference to everything thrown at them. A corridor through that territory was, effectively, a corridor through the safest space in the local galaxy. In exchange, and this was where Gladiator's proposal revealed its deeper architecture, the part that had produced the sequence of recognition and reluctant acknowledgement in the fleet's briefing room. The Shi'ar fleet would do something that no faction in this galaxy could do alone, because no faction in this galaxy was trusted, even partially, by all of the others. They would carry a message, not a diplomatic communique, not a treaty proposal, something more fundamental, the data core's contents, translated into terms each faction could receive, transmitted on their own frequencies, in their own languages, carrying not the Shi'ar's political positions, but their observations. What a civilization from outside this galaxy saw when it looked at the 41st millennium. What the Imperium looked like from outside its own mythology. What chaos looked like to beings who had no warp exposure and no theological investment in its cosmology. What the Necron's awakening meant in the context of a galaxy that had forgotten they existed. What the Tyranid hive mind was, stripped of the terror that prevented clear analysis. A mirror, held up to a galaxy that had been too close to itself for 10,000 years to see its own face. It would not end the wars. It would not resolve the chaos gods or heal the Imperium's stagnation or stop the Tyranid advance. Felindra had been clear about this, and Gladiator had no interest in promises that exceeded what the evidence supported. But it would do something that the galaxy's intractable conflicts had never had. It would introduce into every major faction's decision-making framework a perspective that came from nowhere and owed nothing to anyone, carrying no agenda beyond the simple, radical act of accurate observation. What factions did with accurate observation was their own business. The preparation took 3 days. Inquisitor Dorn's contribution was the most politically costly. She provided the Imperium's internal communication frequencies and the specific linguistic registers that would allow a transmission to reach senior administrative officials rather than being filtered at the Arbites level as Xeno's interference. The cost to her within the Inquisition's internal politics she transmitted to Voss without commentary would be significant. She had decided, after 30 years of studying alien civilizations, that this was the most interesting thing she had ever been adjacent to, and that was sufficient justification. Vorathax's contribution was stranger and more elegant. He provided, through a channel that technically didn't exist, a means of transmitting to chaos-aligned forces in terms that Sench's followers would receive as a new variable in their calculations, rather than a threat to be eliminated. It was, he noted in the accompanying message, the most interesting thing he had arranged in several centuries, and he was curious to observe the downstream effects. Gladiator read this message and filed it in the category of things that were probably true and definitely complicated and moved on. Felindra's contribution was the most personal. She opened a direct channel to the craft worlds, Seer Council, and transmitted the full record of her Black Library research, the Herald pattern, the mending classification, everything. She had carried the Black Library's secrets for decades with the careful isolation of a guardian. Sharing them, even with her own people, was a choice that she sat with for 12 hours before making, and that she made with the calm of someone who had read the skein enough times to trust what it showed when the path was clear. On the 4th day, the Shi'ar fleet moved through the Necron corridor with the tuned ships, arrayed on either side in the silent witness formation that Zareka's Echo had specified. Not escort, not guard, but presence. Ancient machines watching the beginning, they had been dormant for 60 million years to witness. Their green optical sensors, tracking the Shi'ar vessels, with the patient attention of things that understood the significance of what they were seeing, even if they experienced that significance in ways no organic mind could access. The message transmitted as they moved, spreading outward at the speed of light and faster through warp relay and Necron subspace, channels and Eldari infinity, circuits and the particular pathways that a Ancient Demon Prince could open when he had decided to do something genuinely interesting. It would take time to reach everything it was sent toward. Some of what it reached would ignore it. Some would misinterpret it. Some would use it in ways that produced outcomes no one had anticipated. That was the nature of accurate observation, placed in the hands of beings capable of choice. Miravel soon stood at the observation deck viewport as the fleet moved through Necron space, watching the tomb ships. Silent procession with the eyes of someone who had spent 10 days listening to a universe that wasn't hers and had come out of it with something she hadn't brought in. Not wisdom. She was too honest with herself to call it that. Something more provisional than wisdom. An understanding that the warp's vast, predatory, ancient presence was not separate from the galaxy's life, but continuous with it. That fear and hope and belief and despair were not things that happened in minds and then stopped, but things that accumulated, that persisted, that built into forces, that could remake reality if enough of them pointed in the same direction. She understood why it was afraid, not of the Herald, of what the Herald's choice meant, for the system that the warp's feeding depended on, a closed loop, grinding toward entropy, kept alive by its own intractability. That was the meal. The same suffering, recycled endlessly. The same wars refought across millennia. The same hatreds kept warm by the same mythologies. A mirror, held up accurately, was not a weapon, but it was something the loop couldn't easily accommodate. She watched the stars, and the stars watched back, and the warp pressed against the edge of her awareness with something she had initially categorized as a threat and now understood as something more complex, the particular attention of a vast and ancient thing encountering, for the first time and longer than it could precisely measure, something it wasn't sure it could predict. It was, she decided, a reasonable thing to leave uncertain. The last Necron tomb ship passed out of sensor range on the 5th day. Ahead, the fleet's navigational systems, working from data Zareka's Echo had provided, ancient star charts that predated every current civilization in the galaxy, had identified a stable warp transit point that their engineers assessed as viable for the kind of dimensional fold that might, with sufficient precision, be threaded back toward their home reality. Voss looked at Gladiator across the bridge. Odds. Gladiator looked at the transit point on the display. Better than when we arrived, he said. It wasn't certainty, but in the 41st millennium, in a galaxy that had been grinding toward darkness for 10,000 years, better than when we arrived was not nothing. It was, in its modest and provisional way, a beginning. The Eternal Majesty fleet crossed the transit threshold on the morning of the 6th day, measured in ship time, which was the only time that mattered anymore. The dimensional fold opened with none of the violence of their arrival, no wrongness in the light, no color that lived at the intersection of sensation and dread. It opened cleanly, the way a door opens when someone has taken the time to understand its mechanism, and the fleet passed through it into a dark that was simply dark, stars that were simply stars, space that pressed against the hull, with the familiar silence of a universe that was theirs. They did not know if they had come home exactly. Navigation would take hours to confirm, but Miravel soon, standing at her console with her barriers intact and her mind her own again, felt the warp's absence, like the absence of a sound heard so long. It had become part of the background, and she breathed in the quiet of a universe where the dark between stars was only dark, and she wept very briefly and with considerable dignity. What they left behind was not resolution. The Imperium would continue its grinding endurance. Chaos would continue its patient corruption. The Tyranids would continue their consumption of everything in their path. The Necrons would continue their slow, inexorable awakening across a galaxy that had mostly forgotten they existed. These were not problems that a mirror solved, but somewhere in the segmentum obscurus, a message was traveling through warp relays and infinity circuits and channels opened by a demon prince who was for the first time in centuries, genuinely curious about what came next. Inquisitor Dorn was reading her copy for the third time in a safe house that officially didn't exist, making notes in the margins with the focused intensity of someone whose worldview was being structurally renovated from the inside. Felindra of the Black Library was sitting in Ulthwi's great dome, watching the stars through wraithbone walls, feeling in the skein the slow, tentative branching of paths that had been closed for longer than the Imperium had existed. Vorathax was watching all of it, from his vessel in the dark, with the delighted attention of a being encountering genuine surprise for the first time in 3,000 years. And Zareka's echo, in the deep silence of its tomb ship, held a Shi'ar data core in hands of living metal and remembered, across 60 million years of dormancy, what it had felt like to hope that the pattern would come out differently this time. Perhaps it calculated it had.